I wanted to know your perspective on how income measures and things like GDP, they are limited in measuring human well-being. So what can economics actually learn from other social sciences to address that limitedness?
Yes, well, GDP is probably the best single indicator of human welfare, but being the best doesn't mean that it's sufficient. Yeah? I mean, if you have to use just one indicator, I'll still go for GDP, but why should we? Yeah? Today, even the OECD has 36 different indicators to calculate what it calls better life index. Yeah? I mean, OECD has been quite wedded to this idea of the market paradigm, but even the OECD is now recognizing that no, I mean, the income is just one of dozens of aspects that determine human welfare. So it has now indicators relating to job security, quality of community life, health and education. So yes, I mean, the GDP is far too inadequate in measuring true human welfare. But, when you are trying to look at the whole world, 192 countries, it becomes difficult if you begin to use very complicated measures. So that's why I use the GDP indicators. Also, I'm using the GDP indicators because the people who have promoted this the neoliberal ideas, market-driven globalization, they have put so much emphasis on increasing GDP. Yeah? So I'm playing their own game. Yeah? Okay, so the GDP is maybe the most important. Yeah? So let's look at GDP figures. Yeah? And it doesn't work because even in terms of GDP, which is supposed to be the strong point of this the neoliberal free trade, free market policies, it has not performed very well.
I just wanted to ask about those figures, and only regarding developed countries. Sorry. What would you say to the objection if someone were to say that after the Second World War, the countries had a period of higher growth due to them catching up with their potential output? So would that kind of take away some of the strength of your argument, at least for developing countries?
Oh, I'm sure there was some of it, but I don't think it lasted that long. I mean, for example, the per capita income in Germany after the Second World War fell to 50% of its previous peak in 1938. Now, the previous peak was a war economy, so that's actually a bit of an unfair comparison. But even if you take that as the appropriate potential output of Germany, the West Germany recovered that level by 1955. Yeah? So that kind of recovery period didn't last that long, 10 years, maximum 15, depending on the country. And beyond that, I mean, it still lasted for another 2 decades. So yes, I'm not saying that that recovery and catch up is irrelevant, but I mean, it's the only part of the story.
So I have a question about the compensation principle. It's fairly easy to argue for when you're talking only monetary terms, but it becomes a lot more difficult when you talk about export of pollution or export of bad working conditions. I don't know too much, but in China it also sort of destroys the social fabric and gives a lot of the workers have to move away from their families. So how have people talking about the compensation principle argued for those factors?
Right. Well, basically they don't even think about those things, because they are making this argument purely on the basis of monetary income, on the implicit assumption that people have done things because they think the compensation is enough. Yeah? So if you put that, look, I mean, this mother having to move to a city to work in a factory and the child having to live with his grandparents, isn't it a bad thing? the answer would be, well, I mean, if it was really bad, this mother wouldn't have moved. Yeah? So it's not in the framework. Yeah? But yes, I mean, this is a serious issue. I mean, because, GDP, even in the relatively static economy, already has lots of problems. For example, household work and care work, mostly done by women, are not included. Yeah? On the ostensible ground that it's not transacted in the market, and therefore, it's impossible to put a price on it. Well, you can, I mean, after all, when you compile national account statistics, people even impute rents on the houses lived in by the house owners. No, because when I own a house, if I live there, I mean, there's no market transaction, so it's not captured, but it is actually captured. Yeah. They say, well, I mean, this house, if it was put on the rental market, would have fetched the X amount of money, so we are going to estimate that and add it to national accounts. Yeah? Now, they don't do that with the household work. Yeah? So even in a relatively static economy, there's the fundamental problem with GDP as a measure of human welfare, but especially when you're talking about growing economies like China, when this changes in income comes with huge social upheaval, destruction of the natural environment, and kind of even changes in increased attitude and so on. I mean, how do you, calculate them? So we are really working with very, very incomplete indicators.
I just wanted to ask, in your opinion, what is an alternative to neoliberalism? Is it the return to Keynesianism, or is it simply like going back to all the liberal ideology of Austrian School of Economics?
Oh, no, I mean, I think there are many alternatives. I mean, once again, I mean, I'm, as a pragmatist, not really thinking in terms of economic schools, I'm thinking of concrete examples, because, during the Cold War, there was this pretense that all capitalist economies are alike because they are all on the same side, They are all capitalists. Yeah, also the Soviet bloc countries saw them as homogeneous, but actually at least from the 1950s, different capitalist economies developed huge range of different alternatives. Yeah? So the Japanese capitalism is very different from the American one, which is completely different from the Swedish one, which is very different from the French one, and so on. So, you can talk about many different models. Yeah? Different countries that want different things, they have different conditions. So I don't think that you can recommend just that one model as the best practice, even though, by looking at, I don't know, GDP figures or income inequality, you could say that this country has performed better than another. But I don't think there's one right model. But what you have to do is that to really think about the possibility that there are lots of things that can be done, that are being done to control the process of globalization, to mitigate the excesses of the market economy. Exactly what you do for what purpose is up to you, but this belief that is either some pure form of free market economics or Keynesianism or the Soviet-style central planning, I think that's been very unhelpful in all of us thinking about alternatives. Yeah? Because we tend to think in these pure forms. Yeah? But just, when you have doubt, just think about Singapore. Yeah? Those combinations are possible. Yeah?
Following the first question, I was concerned, or I want your opinion. How do you think the picture that you show about different patterns in GDP could change if we consider, like, for example, national income per capita? Because I was concerned, like, for example, in Latin America, there was a big role of the national direct investment in the development of the continent in the last decades, and yeah, you are counting this as a gross domestic product, but is most of the earnings of these big investments is going abroad afterwards. Like, so I was concerned that maybe also will be worse the situation if we consider national income instead of GDP.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, in some countries, it doesn't really matter whether you use GDP or GNP. You know, if you're, I don't know, South Korea or Japan. I mean, sorry, that's the wrong example. Anyway, but in some countries, the gap between the two could be very large. If you're at, say, Sweden or Switzerland, you tend to invest abroad a lot more than you receive foreign investment. So your GNP is actually much bigger than your GDP. If you are Brazil or Mexico, you tend to receive more foreign investment than you invest abroad. So your GDP, which is measuring the activity within your national boundary, is much larger than your GNP, which is the earnings of your national. So it depends on the country. I mean, if you have this large gap, then you will have to look at different numbers. For some countries, it doesn't matter that much. So, I mean, it's basically case by cases.
Yes. I just wanted to clarify how you're separating the correlation from causation with these like figures and that. Because, for example, like in Latin America, since this Brave New World period, they've had a lot of financial crises and hyperinflation, things like that. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, the largest economy, South Africa, had the breakdown of apartheid and all of those kind of things. So I wondered how you are going about sort of separating those events from broader trends.
Yes, no, I mean, of course, it's impossible to separate all those, even at the national level. I mean, you don't even fully understand how things like the end of apartheid is really affecting the economy. You don't have the clear basis for calculating the counterfactual. So I'm not saying that this really explains anything in a serious way, but I'm just showing that if these policies were so good for accelerating growth and creating wealth and so on, how come the result is so miserable? So I'm basically asking the question to people who have advocated these policies. Now they have come up with all kinds of excuses, but does it mean that the earlier period had no problem? No. I mean, 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, it was full of wars, especially in developing countries. Coup d'états, the riots. In every period you could find those things. So, I'm not trying to prove anything by these numbers, but basically asking this question. Well, you haven't really done very well, even in the area where you would do well. So you need to explain this.
You criticised the Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson model of international trade. I was wondering what your opinion is of the older Ricardian model of comparative advantage.
Well, actually, that's an interesting question because Ricardian model of comparative advantage is what made me interested in economics. I learned of that in my high school at a very basic level. And it just blew my mind, because it's so counterintuitive. Yeah, the difference between the Ricardian model and the Heckscher-Ohlin model is that in the Ricardian model, basically what is creating different comparative advantages is differences in technologies. In the Heckscher-Ohlin model, it's the different factor endowments. Now that model is actually far more problematic than the Ricardian model because what it is saying is that all the countries can use the same technologies. So if Guatemala is not producing things like BMWs, it's not because it cannot, but because it doesn't make economic sense. So that model has a lot more problems. Now, having said that, this idea of comparative advantage is one of the ideas in economics, together with things like Keynes's idea of effective demand. One of the ideas that is not a glorified common sense. This is actually very counterintuitive, and you really need to think through it to see the point. And yeah, it's a very important and very useful concept. The problem is that it works only in a static model. So given your technology, given your factor endowments, depending on which version of the theory you use, Ricardian or Heckscher-Ohlin, you know what gives you the maximum return. Yeah, that is very clear. I'm not disputing that. The problem is that trying to stick to that may actually prevent your future development because you are specializing in things with a very low rate of technological progress, specializing in things which has a very high fluctuation in demand and prices, specializing in things where the long-term demand prospect is very low, specializing in things that which can become worthless if someone invents new technology. So that's the fundamental problem with Heckscher-Ohlin in the long run. In the medium term, this factor mobility issue is a serious problem because trickle down doesn't happen. Well, once again, I'm not trying to dismiss the theory. It's a very important theory. It can give you very good anchor in understanding international division of labor and international patterns of international trade, but you have to recognize its limitations.
When you're talking about the agricultural and steel subsidies, you said the motivations for doing so in different governments was to retain the employment, make sure there's not depopulation of rural areas. Is there no other incentives, sort of like, for example, for agricultural, to provide food security and to sort of sustain the urban population?
No, there's the consideration of food security, but in most countries, I mean, the level of extra food security they get by protecting these farmers is very low because they are very small in terms of population. The output is nowhere near enough to satisfy the entire national demand. So, even though, it does help with food security, the contribution is relatively marginal because, it's not as if these countries are giving this protection and thereby, raising food self-sufficiency ratio from 85% to 95%. It's, raising it from, 20 to 25. So, it's not such a strong guarantee. But yes, once again, you are right in saying that there are multiple roles that different sectors play. Some people even argue that agriculture provides what in the technical terms are called environmental services. So basically, it retains the topsoil, it kind of provides kind of environmental habitat for animals and the other species and so on. So, if you think about it, there are multiple roles that the sector plays. So it's, the 2-3 things that I mentioned are things that I think are more important, but that doesn't mean that it's an exhaustive list.
So I wanted to ask about policy in the international sphere, because some of the arguments being made about not opposing the forces of globalization now are that you cannot do it anymore. You cannot put the quantitative restrictions on trade, that you are met with some sanctions if you try do something fishy. So do you think there is a scope to change that for a better kind of environment for the poorer countries and maybe all the countries to develop in better way, grow faster or more sustainably?
Sure. The emergence of the WTO, that is the World Trade Organization, in 1995, and the signing of dozens of bilateral and regional free trade agreement and so on. What you can do in terms of your national policies have been very much restricted. It's not nothing. You can still do a lot of things, but the scope has shrunk. But the argument is, yeah, I mean, these are man-made rules. I mean, it's not like God has given this to us. It's not as if it's a law of gravity. You can rewrite the rules, yeah? And after all, there has been some rewriting of the, I mean, very marginal, but rules in the WTO, for example, about access to medicine and intellectual property rights, yeah? So, yes, I mean, we should put this on table, because once you say, well, these are, beyond control, non-negotiable, well, I mean, you have to ask where did those rules come from? Yeah? It came from political decisions by particular countries, particular people with certain power and agenda, and why should we accept it as unalterable? So yes, we need to discuss the reform of the global system as well. Okay.